you to tell us about opportunities with the Professionalism Committee, please. Thank you.
Yep, so you should have a slide up there. I've just got a few slides so you can kind of see what I'm talking about as I go through. Just to give you a tiny bit of background, the faculty, if you're not aware, developed something called the Core Competency Framework. That was published in the middle of 2020, lays out 111 competencies to be that are considered of what to be required to be a clinical informatician. And once that was published, it's all available on our website if you wanted to look into it. There's 6 domains, 36 categories, I think, and 111 competencies. And then after that, we set up a working group to. It's great having our competency program, but we wanted to make sure it gets implemented, and a working group was set up and published their report at the start of this year of lots of ideas for how we should be taking the competency framework forward. So one of those involved setting up a whole programme of activity, the Professional Competencies Programme, and setting up a new standing committee to oversee that work. So all of the actions to implement the competency framework. So this Professionalism Standing Committee is a group of faculty members, and they work with 2 of our other standing committees, Education and Standards and Membership, to take all these actions forward. So anyone can apply to be in the Professionalism Standing Committee. You just need to have an interest in being involved, really, and have the capacity, I suppose, to join the meetings and get involved. The group currently meets every other month. It's a multi-professional membership, but I did recognise that we didn't have any healthcare scientists in there so far, so I wanted to come along and just let you know that it's an opportunity if it's something you're interested in. The group's chaired by the faculty's Vice Chair Anne-Marie Cunningham, and the Vice Chair of the group is Gareth Thomas. And just to give you a flavour, it's just about having a strategic overview for all of these actions to implement the competency framework. One of the pieces of work that they oversaw was to publish a job description for a CCIO, which you can find on our website now. And then there's 2 pieces of work that are coming up now. I'm literally just setting up the working groups for these now. One is the next piece of work on that CCIO job description. So, you know, how that can be more looking at the structure of the whole of the clinical informatics team, including the CCIO. And also a piece of work on professional accreditation. So this came up in our last membership survey, that people were interested in professional accreditation, but we need to look into what everyone understands by that, because different people understand it to mean different things, and they come at it from different angles and they want different things from it. So it's a scoping study to find out what people want, what the opportunities are, and make some recommendations about how we move forward. So if you wanted to join the Professionalism Standing Committee, I'll put a link. There's a form you can fill in. I'll put that in the chat in a moment. And if more specifically you wanted to join one of the working groups that I've put in bold at the bottom there, easiest thing is probably just to get in touch with me. I'll put my email address up on the screen in a second, and I can give you some more information about what would be involved in the time commitments and so on. So yeah, I'm Lindsay Turner. That's my email address in the middle there. Or if you can't, you could just send it to the info one as well, if that's easy to remember. And yeah, thank you for just having a listen to some of those opportunities of other ways you can get involved in the faculty through your membership. Okay.
That's great. Thank you very much, Lindsay. I do hope that some of the special interest group members will put themselves forward for that. It would be great to have some healthcare scientists on that group. And also to note, we do have at least one healthcare scientist on the diversity and inclusion working group that the faculty has. And if anyone else would be interested in joining that, they would be very welcome. And again, if you could contact Lindsay for that, or myself, or Jess, who looks after this committee as well, we'd be very happy to point you in the right direction. Thank you. So, Andrew Sunley, I've worked with Andrew for a number of years now on pathology messaging. Andrew's been in this field for a number of years and recently successfully led NHS Digital's work on pathology messaging and taxonomy. So, Andrew, welcome, and we're looking forward to hearing what you've got to tell us about how this applies to the wider diagnostic arena. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert, for that, and thank you all for joining today. It's nice to see some names on there that I recognise as well that have been involved in the work that Robert's just outlined. Hopefully you can see my presentation slide now. Excellent, thank you. I may not be able to, when I switch now to presentation, I may not be able to see you. So there will be an opportunity for questions at the end. I can't keep an eye on the chat at the same time, or hands, so I do apologise. It's just the way that our systems then are set up. So as Robert says, I work for NHS Digital. My name is Andrew Sunley. I'm one of the programme managers. And what I've been focusing on is pathology and the standards in pathology, but right from the start in my involvement, which I'll talk you through today, we were very cognizant that pathology is part of the wider diagnostics arena, and everything we built is cognizant of that, and we wanted to keep an eye on that as well and make sure that it should then be applicable. So hopefully it will be, and it'll be of interest to you as I talk you through. So this, as I say, is my involvement. So I was involved from 2018. There were many other pathology initiatives and other diagnostics efforts before then, but this is my personal view and journey of my involvement from 2018. And the reason I got involved is, at the time, the Chief Clinical Information Officer of the NHS, Dr. Simon Eccles, had identified 7 interoperability or information sharing priorities, and the link is available if anyone wants to read about any of the others. But one of them was about exchanging pathology results, and what we wanted to do was then utilize some standards to be able to make it interoperable, but also as well meet the clinical needs. So at the same time, there was the Future of Healthcare vision, and then NHS Digital published a standards framework, including some international standards, which we then looked at. Anyone who's familiar, it's things like SNOMED, Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources, which is the message specification, and then also a units of measure standard as well, which is an international one, which I will tell you about later. So what I'll do today is I will then give you a view of what I was involved in as part of the team, but it was a collaboration. So Robert mentioned that we've been working together and also with the faculty as well. But we started, and we then took a step back in 2018-19 and did a whole system-wide discovery and a lessons learned from some of those previous diagnostic and pathology works that had done previously. And there is a report of that 30 years before I got involved, and it is available on our site. I'll give you a link to at the end, but it is also available from that link that is on here. The year after, what we did following that discovery was develop the products which then were the future standards at the time, which are now the standards that have been approved. And then we did have an intention of then completing the development the year after. However, COVID then became involved, and we then delivered some tactical solutions, but we did align them back to the strategic solutions. And some of the lessons we learned from COVID, we have been able to then implement as well. So the year after, what happened was the standards approval and the preparation for implementation. So this is up to the point when I then have finished my area of work because of the standards approval, but I'll give you a view of some of the things that are prepared for implementation and the extension and enhancement for pathology, and equally, as we're saying, potentially for diagnostics, which will be the next area, but equally it could be applicable to genomics and other areas as well, because the standards we've built them on will meet all those needs and requirements. So if I talk you through discovery, and one of the things we learned, which I'm sure many of you already know already, is that there are lots of information flows across the system, not just for pathology, but this one is based on pathology, and it uses many of the standards, as well as lots of local information that needs to be exchanged and lots of specific clinical information that needs to be carried that can't be then transferred electronically. So what we did as part of discovery is that we then realized that even though there were lots of those different flows and standards involved, generally speaking, there is a simplified process that is generally followed from the patient and the healthcare professionals, and then requesting tests and then getting results. So we felt that we could then utilize the standards to enable us to safely exchange the clinical information that was required by the clinicians. And again, this is a generic process based on pathology. However, it's not a million miles away that we found out from other areas as well. So we looked at requirements as part of discovery, and what we realized is, in terms of the three different areas, there was a very strong arm's length body need for results, as well as the clinical need to be able to do trends and analysis as well. And there was a strong push from the count and accounting in terms of how many requests were done and some of the workforce data that could be then aligned with that. The thing that we decided not to get into was the processing within the labs. So because there is variation within the labs, there's many different systems, as we've said, there's different ways of flowing all those different things. There was concerns around the coding rather than the words and descriptions, and how much that change would need to be. We decided to then park that, for want of a better word, but it may well come into implementation, but we may well decide not to actually then standardize any of those areas and leave the individual labs and the exchange to actually then do their own thing and then feed into the standards that were then being built. So we looked at it from a clinical perspective and a standards perspective. So hopefully from a clinical perspective, you would understand that the word sodium substance concentration in plasma is a clinical, it can either be a request or result. This then happens to be the result, which is the full description. So what we did was, as long as we were then producing the words that the clinicians would understand, we were saying, don't worry about the code. That we need it for the standards transmission to electronically do that, but we don't expect anyone to remember the long codes, or if indeed even have those displayed on their system. As long as we could agree the wording, then we could then actually utilize that information. The value is important. So this just happens to be a quantitative value, but it could be qualitative values as well, and interpretations. And we could then exchange the codes, the description, the value, and where applicable, if needed, some sort of unit of measure. So micromoles per litre is this just example. And we could then exchange all that within a fire message specification. So this is actually an example of the fire message specification, and this is an example of one of the test requests and results. So this is actually the result, the full one, but the request is a shortened version of this. So we call this the bundle, or unofficially this is the onion, but it is exchanging all that information plus anything that is free text or needs to be carried from a clinical perspective to ensure that the information is transferred and is available wherever anyone wants to have it to make a clinical decision. So from that basic discovery, we moved on to the development of the products, which then became the standards. So very similar. Around the outside here, we split into 4 different work streams based on those standards. So we have the unified test list, which is based on SNOMED, which is the clinical terminology standard. The units of measure that I mentioned earlier, which is based on an international standard called UCOM, which is the unifying code for units of measure. And then the message specification standard, which is based on health level 7 and fast healthcare interoperability resources. So we could then build the standards from that. But the main thing from my perspective and the team's perspective, and Simon Nichols agreed with this, is that we needed to build these things for you who were using it and the other stakeholders. So this was a massive collaborative effort. It wasn't an NHS digital thing that was done to others. It was very much around this is how we can work together. What would work? Can we meet all the different stakeholder needs? So I will talk you through quickly some of those different areas that we looked at. Just to give you a bit more detail if need be. We started with the one that was in the top right hand side in terms of an information model, and very similar to the process, we realized that there were some generic high level information that needed to be exchanged. So this is the high level example, and I've just then as the next slide given you a lower level detail. So there's more detail under each of these, and we worked with the professional record standards body and the digital exemplars and the sites who were exchanging pathology information from the high volume blood sciences to be able to build this. But since then, we have verified this model, and it applies to other areas in pathology and potentially into diagnostic areas as well. So then what we also did is then we mapped it to the message specification or the FIRE model. So apologies if anyone is colorblind, but there is red and black text on here. So the text in black or at the top of these boxes is from the information model, and then the equivalent within FIRE is underneath, prefixed by FHIR, but it's pronounced by FIRE, which is actually red. And we realized that we could map from the information model to the message specification to be able to transfer all that information that I mentioned earlier in the onion. And then what we did is there's a number of different message profiles within the message specification, and we identified and worked with a number of different stakeholders via an organisation called Interopen, and it included some of your members as well to say, well, what would actually work? Which of these profiles would we be able to use? And as it happens, one of them, which is in the top right-hand corner, is the diagnostic report. So the report is applicable to all of diagnostics, but we utilise that for pathology. But equally, a procedure request or an observation would be something that would be recognisable. As it mentions in the bottom left-hand corner, what we didn't do was utilise all the resources, and the generic profiles for like patient, the practitioner, and the organisation is used in any care setting. So equally, they are applicable not just to pathology or diagnostics, but to anywhere else as well. And I'll talk to you a bit more later regarding how as that will be developed. So the other thing that we produced then was what we call the unified test list, which if you remember is based on the clinical terminology standard, which is SNOMED. But what we were looking for was the names of the tests and the results which are used in the systems, which then we could standardize and then we could use. And what we did for the formal standards approval is we based that on the blood sciences. We added some microbiology elements in which, when we did some information sharing events, was identified as the next priority and an area of pathology specialism that hadn't been looked at previously. And we also then incorporated anything that had previously been used and was still useful. So in primary care, they still use the pathology bound code list, which again is based on SNOMED. But then we then took any of those requests and results that were already in existing and in use and incorporated them within the unified test list. The other thing that we did in terms of the units of measure is that we needed to be able to exchange units in a system electronically, so they were computable. So we felt that it wasn't sufficient enough just to be able to include the description of the unit of measure that was used. In certain areas, it would actually then be part of the test and the result. So these are the challenges that we looked at. This was the approach that we took. We had a look at what was existing, and we based a lot of the information on the feedback on the laboratory standardized representation. And then we aligned it and we checked if it would fit with the UCOM. And we identified with all that feedback that it would fit with the UCOM model. And the owners of UCOM, which is an organisation called Reagan Street, then agreed a process with us that if we identified any additional units which weren't in the international standard, or a subset of that, which is the healthcare units, the most commonly used healthcare units, they will add that into the international version as well. So that is why we didn't then build a separate units of measure standard ourselves. So the other thing we did was an iterative approach, and now that this has been established, this is what will be then used again going forwards to then complete all the pathology specialist areas, and could equally be used to then develop the diagnostic areas. So this does work through from number 1 at the bottom all the way through, but it follows a agile approach. So very much about releasing information and getting feedback. We would then base these things on a standard template, which is in number 2, which is very much what I talked around earlier about. There are certain elements of the information model and certain elements of information which are fairly generic. We had to make sure that it matched the standards model and also the message specification model. So we would then check those things, but then we would be using the information from the clinical systems, but we would then do a double check back with the clinicians to make sure that the words that we were using would be understandable. And if we couldn't put the words in the terminology standard, then we would incorporate it either in the units of measure standard or the message specification, whichever is most appropriate. So we would then agree which was the best way to do it. So it's not everything in the terminology standard, not everything ultimately would be in the message specification standard. We also then had an existing user group. It has an awful acronym, and it's just digital very good with lots of acronyms. But basically that is the pathology user group. And we would then check the information with them. And then we would also then do a final clinical assurance review. And then one of our other awful acronyms is the PSGB, which is a governance group, which Robert sits in and actually chairs now. But it is actually for multiple stakeholders to actually assure that what we are producing is fit for multiple stakeholders. So not just clinicians and terminologists, but also suppliers, patient representatives as well. And then we would then do a beta release. So once all that had been done, we would then release in a beta, and then we would then gain further feedback from wider stakeholders. So anyone can give us feedback at any of these stages, and we will take on that feedback, and then we would then change. And then even when we've gone into the final stage, which is then making these things live, doesn't mean that we wouldn't change it. If it is not fit for purpose, we would then be able to then change again as well. So as I mentioned, then COVID came along, and we learned a number of things from COVID. And I'm saying, you see, hesitantly that we made it simpler, but there is a very complicated diagram, so very similar to the information flow. So I've split it down. Basically, simpler was in terms of 3. So what we did is we took the data flows that were needed for COVID, which included tests and results that are done within the pathology lab. I'm sure you're aware that the National Pathology Exchange then was a conduit for sharing that information. And we took the mention of Randox, etc., and things like that, with the external organisations and lighthouse labs and the ones that were set up for COVID. So basically all that information was taken and then brought into NHSD. So you don't have to worry about the detail of this, but there's lots of stuff then that happens within NHS Digital in terms of managing data, making sure it's safe. And then we would exchange and send that out, not only to the clinicians and the GPs and for secondary uses, but also to the arm's length bodies for making population health decisions. So I split it into 3 to then say that it is actually a simplifier, but I've also included the full diagram if need be. So this was for the whole pillar 2, as we called it, antigen and antibody testing, requests and results, which doesn't look much simpler than the information flows that I showed you earlier. However, what we did do, which was simplified, we produced some guidance on the feedback of that, and it was around the naming and the processing. And the reason why I put coding in brackets on here, but this link is to the actual document if you need to read it, is it wasn't about the coding, as I mentioned earlier. It was about exchanging the information that could be recognised by a clinician or a layperson, and then enabling that to be processed. And we've then continued on utilising that information. The other thing that was produced on the back was a number of implementation options, which are what are then based on when I come and talk to you regarding the implementation options going forwards. They are still open for discussion. They are still being debated as to the best way forwards for implementing. And then the other thing that we did to make things easier to transition from what is existing is that we built a pathology adapter, but equally it was applicable to screening as well. So the same adapter was built to move message information and all those tests and results from EDIFACT, which is the old message specification standard, into FHIR, which is the new message specification standard. And we've given suppliers and anyone else that adapter to enable that jump from some of that old 30-year-old technology that I talked around earlier. So then what happened was the standards approval, which was a year later because of COVID than we wanted it to be. But within this year, we managed to gain approval following a proof of concept testing and end-to-end testing, which was done with our colleagues in South, Central and West region. It involved EMIS, Kurdan, XLab, who are the owners of National Pathology Exchange, to prove that these things would work, the principles would work. And we got the standard approved based on blood sciences and the microbiology and the pathology bound code list information that I mentioned earlier. And then we said we would build on that with the other pathology specialisms. So since then, in August, what happened is we've been in discussions with a number of different people regarding implementation and compliance and what does that mean next. So as well as doing the development, which is on the left-hand side here, we still aim to then have all of those standards incorporating all of the 17 pathology specialist areas as defined by the Royal College of Pathologists by the end of April 2023. But equally, we then had discussions with suppliers in September to prepare them for building systems that would comply with the standards and use these, and then would in the future then be able to then retire and then transition. And we've been working with more acronyms, which you'll be pleased to know, hopefully we'll all then join now after the Lady gave a review into NHS England, but with all the current parties, NHS E, I, X and D, regarding how that would be done. So that brings me on to the implementation, extension and enhancements. So in terms of the development, the roadmap is for pathology and diagnostics, but I've added the diagnostic elements on the end here. So what's published on the our website, which is the full title is at the bottom, and it's included in the slide deck, is the planned roadmap of moving through those different pathology specialist areas, undertaking the user research, and then building the 3 different standards in line with those requirements. And then next year, so everything on the left-hand side is for this year up until March 2022. The backlog is those that are expected to be done next fiscal year, which is 2022-23, which is up until March 2023. And then the expectation is, but we haven't agreed, but I've called it pipeline, we would then move into different diagnostic areas which haven't been covered. And these are just some examples of what they are. It would need to be agreed as to what the priorities are and which of those areas then we will be looking at. So just to give you an idea of timeline from 2021, I'm sure you've seen some of these things already. In the Diagnostics Recovery and Renewal report, which was produced by Professor Sir Mike Richards, one of the recommendations is recognising the work that NHS Digital has done needs to be expanded across all the diagnostic areas, and it should be accelerated. So there is a clear recognition that pathology is only part of the wider diagnostics area, and we are in discussions about how we can then move those things faster. The other thing was the draft data strategy, which was published as well, and it mentioned within there modernising data architecture. And I've included the early conversations already on that link of the architecture for the whole of diagnostics, including pathology, which could then be adopted as the whole architecture across the whole of the NHS system. But again, these discussions are still ongoing. There's an opportunity to feed into these discussions as well, with a view that they'll be by the end of March 2022, that they'll be able to give you an idea as to what information would be in the architecture, and we can all work to the same architecture. The other thing which has already been announced, and I know Jonathan sits on the steering group as well, so Jonathan Kay, there is a set of core UK fire profiles, which will include all those pathology messaging profiles that I mentioned earlier. So everything we've built for pathology has already been adopted and will be used in the core, and then will be then built on going forwards. So if you're interested in any of the other information that I've talked about today, I've included the links of all the different areas from our collaboration site. And at the bottom, there is an email for the team. Like I say, I've moved on, so I don't actually work in this area anymore. But if need be, I can answer some questions. But if you can direct anything to them, they will be able to help and move these things on. So that then brings me to the end of my presentation. So thank you for your time. I will come out of presentation mode, because like I said, I can't see if anyone's asked any questions already, or if anyone wants to do.
Andrew, thank you very much. That was a very fast canter through a very detailed and complex piece of work which you led, and successfully got to the snappily named DAPB 4017 standard. I'm sure that's very memorable. There are a couple of questions in the chat. First one from James Nottle. Do you want me to read it out, or can you see that?
I can see them now. Thank you, Robert. Now I've come out of that. So Sharon, she said first was the first one, wasn't it? I haven't missed any before that.
No.
So yes. So yes, Sharon, as Jess will distribute the slides, the links on the slides and the hyperlinks are all available and working. If any of them don't work, let me know. And equally on the last slide, before the questions one, all those are links to the NHS digital collaboration space. And if anyone wants to get involved, they can do. Sorry, and Jess, you've already answered, haven't you, Jess? Sorry. You see, if only I'd have read that one first. James asked regarding, sorry, something else has just come on my screen, so I can't see now the question. Edifactor fire adapter, is there a readable schematic for that? Sorry, lots of questions keep moving, so another question keeps moving now. So how the data fields map to the old version number. Yes, so there's lots of information on that link, James, that I have provided. It goes into different levels of information, right the way down to detailed individual data item level. So depending on what level you want, there's a high level description, but then it will then work through. And if you need any technical assistance, because as you realize, I'm not technical, if you want any technical support, there is a contact name on there for our development team within NHS Digital who developed that, and they can help with that, as well as the pathology team if need be. Unless anyone shouts up and I haven't answered these questions fully, I'm going to just continue on, but please stop me if I'm not answering fully or in line with your question. Claire asks, how comprehensive is the universal test list? So at the minute, the universal or unified test list covers all the high volume blood sciences areas, so hematology, chemical pathology, and also microbiology. So there are some edge cases outside of there. Plus there are a number of different areas from the pathology boundary code list. And we currently at the minute have some feedback out for, or some descriptions and codes out for feedback, whether they're fit for purpose around the cellular pathology area. So the cellular pathology area has then been split down in terms of the roadmap that I showed earlier. So we think, and certainly from feedback, the cellular pathology will cover a number of other pathology specialist areas, for example, pediatric and perinatal, oral and maxillofacial as well. So they are available in draft and ready to be used. And then we are looking to the other backlog areas that I mentioned earlier next year. But the feedback I've had is that they are lower volume. But if you feel that we are not covering the areas that you need and you want to influence that priority list, then please let us know at that email address or via one of the groups, and we will then go back to the Royal College of Pathology, who are part of our wider programme group, and they set the ultimate priorities.
Andrew, just on that, in terms of accessing the list, that's one of the links on your slide, and there is a human readable version of that just to skim down. But also the Pathology National User Group you mentioned is a good place for people to join. It's a open group that people can join where they can raise particular issues which are then brought back up. Is that correct?
Yep, so the user group is open to anyone who wants to either hear about NHS Digital's work or they want to get involved and raise anything at the user level. Equally, I'm going to drop you in it, Robert. As I mentioned as well, Robert chairs our governance board as well. So yeah, if need be, and I can see John Williams is on here as well, and I mentioned Jonathan Kay who sent this, so they are also represented on our governance group and they can influence priorities and other areas as well. And Robert has also then just recently joined our programme board group, whereby Robert sits with NHSX, NHSD, NHSE&I and the Royal College of Pathology to then agree and discuss those priorities. But please, if you want to involve you, let us know, and we can then hopefully get you involved in those different groups to gain your feedback.
Indeed, and to be completely clear, I deputise for Laszlo Igali, who's the chair of the Royal College of Pathologists Informatics Committee, and so I deputise for him on the group that Andrew's just mentioned. But yeah, happy to pick up any areas that people think are missing. There are I think several thousand now, aren't there, terms in there, and Andrew, so I can't remember all of them, but certainly if it's on the PBCL list, then it's been covered already by the team. That's correct, isn't it? Yeah.
It is, yeah. And just to mention, I know you did say about access to the unified test list. So I can only understand it under human readable version. So Robert has mentioned the link that I gave you goes to both the human readable and the machine readable version. But to access the machine readable version, you've got to access that via another great acronym of ours, TRUD, TRUD, which is the Technology Release Update Distribution Mechanism, he says. It might not be quite that, but the links are from that area as well. And again, if you have members within your trusts or your areas who are more of the technical nature, they can access that information as well.
That's great. And I can see Elizabeth's got her hand up. Elizabeth?
Thank you. That was a really interesting talk. I'm a trainee scientist in cancer genomics. So I was really interested to see that sort of genomics is on your roadmap. My question was, we've got the sort of test directory in genomics at the moment, but from what I've seen, I don't think there's any sort of SNOMED codes for genomic testing. So is the plan that there will be SNOMED codes associated with genomic testing?
Great question. Thanks for that, Elizabeth. So I think it's fair to say that there's a bit of debate around this. However, in terms of SNOMED being the clinical terminology standard to enable interoperability and to exchange information electronically, that is definitely the approved, and Robert mentioned another one. So the Data Alliance Partnership Board, who approve all the standards, are very clear that that is the way forwards. However, there is the discussion very similar to what we talked about earlier, is which are the local systems and which are the national systems. So the local systems could still use potentially their own standards and descriptions. There would need to be a transition now from what has already been built within the genomics area to these standards, the same way as we were talking about pathology and other areas, and that bit hasn't been agreed as of yet. Equally, and you may well be able to correct me if I've got this wrong, but certainly from my discussions when I used to speak to the genomics team, they also have a different message standard, and it's exactly the same conversation with that. So they recognise it needs a standard list and a standard message specification. They are just not using the same standard message specification. which I know is a frustration for everyone, including myself, is why isn't there just one? And hopefully we will get to that agreement as part of the FIRE core discussions. But then it'll take time, as it will do for pathology, to then transition. It will do for genomics as well.
Thank you.
Okay. I noticed Alan. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to check whether we fully answered Claire's question before we moved on, Andrew, about comprehensive testing. If Claire wants to.
Yes, sorry. Yes, that's fine. I'll have a look at the list. Thank you.
Thanks,
See if
Claire.
we're on it.
Yeah, and if not, say the user group and or go through me, and we'll put you in touch with the team, and it can get added to the list.
Yeah, that's great.
Thank you. So Andrew, back to you for the questions.
Yeah, so I've just seen another question from Alan. He noted I mentioned NHS England, NHS Wales, etc. also part of this process. So yes, absolutely. Again, when we started out, Simon Eccles is the Chief Clinical Information Officer for England. So the original scope was to look at England. However, we recognise that not only is this applicable to the home countries within the United Kingdom, so Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, but it is equally applicable to the international arena as well. So yes, we've been in discussions with NHS Wales. I can tell you that. I think it's been announced now that they've just purchased a new system, and they will be looking to be utilising the standards within that new system. Similar conversations with Scotland. They haven't made their decision in terms of their new systems within their country, but they are fully involved with these discussions. Northern Ireland have partly bought a new system using these standards, and again, it'll take time to transition. But they are all aware, they are all involved in the conversations, and they are on all those groups. He says, try and remember, yes, they are. They have representation on the user group and the extended governance group in terms of the development as well. And equally, we are also engaging in the international arena. So I mentioned that we are engaging with Reagan Street, who are the owners of UCOM, which is the Units of Measure Standard. We are also engaging with the Health Level 7 International, as well as the UK for the message specifications. And we're also engaging with SNOMED International and all their members as well, with a view that this is equally applicable in England, in the UK and around the world. Does that answer your question? Oh, yeah.
That's good. Andrew, I've got a question more around implementation, and it's one that's been posed of me, and either I've got a complete memory failure or it's a gap in standards generally, and I'm hoping it's the latter. So when people come to implement these standards in their individual LIMS or in their networks LIMS and so on, what standards around data integrity are there for migrating old data into new systems?
Yeah, you haven't missed it, Robert. So again, another thorny issue that there is a debate. So when I mentioned that there is an ongoing discussion with the arm's length bodies, it's not just with the arm's length bodies, it's with a number of different stakeholders. And that is the big question that needs to be asked in terms of implementation. Well, sorry, there's a number of different big questions that need to be asked. How do we move from the existing to the as is to the to be structures, be it architecture, but also, like I say, in terms of level of maturity of the system, compliance, and also then doing all that assurance. And because it's such a big undertaking, that hasn't been answered fully yet. And I would expect it would be similar to our approach, is that information will be then shared over time, and there needs to be a roadmap for doing exactly that you've just described. Hopefully that will be available early 2022, but which was in line with the data strategy. However, we are now December, and apart from the architecture strategy, I've not seen it yet. But equally, if you or anyone else wanted to be involved in that, we can put you in touch with NHSX, who are doing a consultation around those areas, generally under interoperability and implementation. But I think there's a number of different, more bespoke and specific consultations that they've got out as well.
That'd be interesting, and yeah, I'd be interested to know what to get the detail of the consultations to decide, and if it's okay with you, perhaps share them with the group.
Yeah, it's fine with me. I just don't have them at the minute. So between you and I, we can speak to Richard and Pete, who are members of the team. Sorry for anyone else who doesn't know who we're talking around. But they've been more involved in the implementation discussions. The only one that I had access, which is the one I dropped in, was the architecture one that I dropped into the presentation slide. But those members of the program board, who I know you said that you were deputising for Laszlo, but you have access to now in terms of NHSX, they're the ones who are leading that work, so we can definitely get you in touch one way or another.
Yeah, so if people want to find out more about that, I'm happy to have that come through, and I'll try and pick that up with the team. Although I'm not here on their behalf, I'm here chairing for the SIG. Thank you. That's really helpful, Andrew. There's another question in the chat, Andrew, from James, which is Yep. Go on. Where you go.
Sorry. Yeah, about has this been piloted in the acute trust yet? I can't remember the full list in South, Central and West, because I can never remember exactly where it is in the country, but it's near London down there. Apparently it's a region. And what we did, I only mentioned the suppliers, didn't I? So they exchanged information from a full end-to-end, from request, GP request, all the way through, and a secondary care request. And I'm pretty sure it included acute trusts. And that is a case study that is available, which we can share. And if in the case study it doesn't tell you which of those acute trusts were involved, we can definitely get that information from that region and from the team. So sorry, I just can't remember them all off the top of my head.
I'll just come to Elizabeth in a second. I think that was a very technical test, though, wasn't it? It probably didn't involve sort of large chunks of information in a routine way that labs would normally send things. It was a technical, can you move this from point A to point B, C and D through the system? Is that right, Andrew?
It is, but as I understood it, yes. So certainly in terms of volume, it wasn't that test. Yes, very much it was focused on technically, was it possible? There will be some other pilots and tests that will extend that, but as I understood it, we also then had frontline clinicians involved in that and exchanging the data that they wanted to see and making sure that they could see what they wanted.
Great, thank you. Elizabeth.
Thank you. This might be a really naive question, so I apologise in advance. Can most LIMS systems are they ready to deal with fire messaging standards, or is this something that we'll have to get new LIMS systems? Because I think we're using HL7 version 2.8, but I'm not totally familiar with fire, so I don't know whether our LIMS systems can cope with that at the moment.
Yeah, so very similar to what we're saying to Robert earlier regarding that transition plan. What we've agreed, which is the reason why we went to get a standards approval, and we've agreed with NHS England and Improvement, as they currently are, that as and when new LIMS systems are purchased, they will then adopt the new standards, and the suppliers will provide a system and will not be paid unless they provide a compliant system that is in line with the new standards. However, we know that you only buy LIMS systems sometimes every 30 years. So that's why it needs that transition through. So the early indications are there are very few current LIMS systems that are mature enough to utilise the current fire standards. And there are a number of different versions within fires. So I use fire, yes, but you're absolutely right. Version 2, 3, STU3, R4, etc., etc. And we need to be able to, as a system, agree how do we transition from the as is to the future. But unlikely, yes, as you stand, that you will be able to do. So these are the future standards that everyone will build to eventually, but unlikely to do now. However, if anyone has bid for any money from NHS England improvement for LIMS upgrades as part of the Diagnostics Capability Programme work, it will be included in there. So they are starting to purchase new systems that will come online from March next year that will be compliant.
It's interesting because we're going through like a regional consolidation at the moment, so we are getting a new LIMS as we speak. So it seems like we might just have missed the boat on that, but yeah.
It depends on the region. So this is why I'm sorry, when I mentioned South, Central and West region earlier, I can't remember exactly how it fits and how it fits with the pathology networks, because they overlap, but they don't exactly meet. So in terms of the pathology networks, it is highly likely that it will have been included in the specification, because all the pathology networks have been told. Now, hopefully that links to your region. If it doesn't, then yes, it may well be missed. However, again, equally, if you don't have contacts for the pathology networks, we can get them from NHS England and improvement for your region. If you tell me what the region was and what your pathology network was, they would be able to give me the contacts straight away. I'm just not familiar with how the jigsaw overlaps, if that's not a bad analogy.
And James?
Further to that, I guess we can control. There's only a limited pool of LIMS suppliers, so they can be pushed in that direction. But then about the disparate systems that are taking the message downstream, it's obviously a bigger piece of work to get that all. If we think in our local region, the GPs are still taking Edifact, so they're behind PMIT, behind HL7. So where's that drive coming from the PMS suppliers? Are they getting a sort of similar approach?
Yep. So this is part of that supplier forum that NHS X&D and I&E hosted. We had, I forget the numbers, and again, Robert or John may well be able to correct me if I'm wrong, but we had an extensive number of suppliers across the whole range who attended. So we invited every supplier that we knew to that forum to be able to explain to them, this is what the standards are, this is what support's available to the trust so that they can buy systems from you, and these are the compliance and maturity measures that they are. So I mentioned in terms of the pilot, it included Kurdan, who were quite a small LIMS provider, the National Pathology Exchange, who are owned by XLab, and EMIS as well. So we try to get a whole range within there, and we are in discussions, as in all the arm's length bodies, as we're currently known, are in discussions about what is needed to incentivise, lever, and get money, but the money will come via the trusts. We are not intending to pay directly to the suppliers to then upgrade their systems. Does that answer your question, James? Sorry.
It does, yeah. I just wonder as well if there'll be more requests for more of those adapters, because the Edifact Fire seems like quite a powerful tool, although I guess it depends where it's sat, if it has to be deployed locally or if it's at mesh or wherever. I can understand why I've gone for that one to start with because of the GP system. So is there a sort of thought to develop a HL7 to Fire adapter?
Yeah, so
to Fire.
What? Sorry, James. Yeah,
That's
so sorry.
all right.
When I mentioned Fire, Fire is a version of HL7.
Yep.
So the debate that is ongoing, and again, sorry for saying this in a slightly different way, but probably similar to what I said before. There is the debate around how many versions of Fire will be supported, and what mechanisms are there to be able to exchange. So there are opposite viewpoints, and you may well have seen again recently there is a discussion about reducing the number of APIs and reducing the number of standards. So that is one school of thought. The other school of thought, the opposite end of that spectrum, is yes, we need to provide adapters and mappings and everything else from every single version to every other single version. But obviously that would take a lot of resource and time. So as part of those strategy discussions, as part of the data, the draft data strategy that I mentioned earlier, and we will link you into, there are discussions, that exact discussion around what will happen. On that API page, the link that I've given you, though, is specifically to the API, that individual API. The next level up, there are a number of other APIs that are available from NHS Digital, but it won't include every single combination.
Thanks, Andrew. And I think what I think Elizabeth Bates said, you know, was this a fairly simple question? And there's no such thing as a simple or naive question in this field. Something that I have learned when I started to take an interest in it was that it covers a huge range of disciplines and expertise, and you come across people who know in huge detail very specific areas. I consider myself a novice in this, just for pathology, never mind the wider diagnostic area, even though I chair the governance committee. And I think the more people we can get into this field, there are very few people who have an overall grasp of it at both the high level and the technical level. And they're experts in all areas. So the more people want to get involved in this, it's a fascinating area, and we're all learning. So it's not, there is no single expert around this that I think you could say, yeah, that they know it and they'll sort it. So thank you. Are there any other questions? So Andrew, I don't know whether you'd agree with that or whether you.
No, wholeheartedly agree. And I was saying, just going back to it, the collaboration is key. Absolutely, there's no one person who understands that. It's certainly not me either. So I've been learning, and I'm still learning as I go along now. And it's trying to get all that collaboration and those great minds working together, which hopefully now we've started the ball rolling, will continue. But please, if anyone else wants to be involved, then please do so.
Yep, absolutely, and you'll be very welcome. And you can ask the questions which we probably haven't asked yet. And there's another question in the chat from James.
Yep. So work with DICOM. How will this align work with DICOM standard in imaging? Yes. So we are working with what's called digital pathology areas. So I forget the official name. I just know that Darren Traynor leads that, and he's based near me in Leeds, so I see him. But there are others around the country who are looking at this. As part of that work, the DICOM standard, which is like, yeah, as you say, the imaging standard, there are some links to SNOMED already, but in terms of the images themselves, the expectation is that DICOM will work alongside the existing standards that I've outlined today.
Thank you. Conscious that we've reached the hour, but happy to take any more questions if Andrew's happy to stay on for a little bit. But I'd like to thank you again, Andrew. I've got one other question. You mentioned agile. We are going to be agile in this. And it took me a while to realise that is actually a thing, not just a general descriptive term. And I didn't know if you wanted to just briefly say what an agile approach to things is in the way in which informatics people refer to it.
Yeah, I do apologise. I probably didn't cover it very well when it was my circle diagram. No, it wasn't. So as ever with these things, there are two agiles, at least two agiles. So there's one with a capital A, which is a certifiable thing. Yeah, certifiable. Yeah, why not? But yes, you can get a qualification in agile. And then there is an agile approach with a lowercase a, which is probably what we all do without even realizing it. So both of them really are based on the premise of what you would do is you would not define everything up front, because as soon as you define it, it's already out of date. So if you are personally planning on going on holiday next year, chances are something's going to change before then. So what you would do is you would have an agile approach. So what you do is you release what you know now. So the way we used it is we looked at blood sciences as an example, and we released the blood science information for feedback. We then changed the blood sciences area. We refined it, we then sent it out for feedback. Rather than us trying to say, we'll do all of pathology or all of diagnostics all in one go, then that's what we mean by taking an agile approach. Similarly, this is what we did with the standard. So rather than waiting for all of the pathology area to be covered in all of the standards and then get approval in what, 3 years, 5 years, 6 years time, we got the approval now to be able to say, well, look, if this fits with your area now, why don't you use it and implement it, which will then make it easier for you rather than doing a big bang later. So does that explain, or is that just confuse things even further?
Well, there's no question. Anyone got any questions on that? I just thought it'd be useful to kind of sort of emphasize that. Thank you. Okay, are there any other questions? Well, I'd like to thank Andrew again for taking the time to present what's been a very interesting talk. We've had a lot of questions and a lot of interest. The links are in Andrew's slides, which will be circulated. For those who aren't members of the faculty, we'd encourage you to join so you can access more of these talks. And if you are a member and would like to join the special interest group and you haven't already, then we'd very much like to hear from you to join the special interest group. Next meeting will be on the 18th of March which is a Friday at 12 o'clock. We meet quarterly, and Jan Hugenhoff will be with us. She is the lead for the business and operations at the faculty, and we'll be talking about how we as a special interest group can become further involved in activities at the faculty. Oh, there's Jan. Hello, Jan. And apologies for mispronouncing your name there. So it merely remains for me to thank everyone for joining. It's a great turnout, and to wish you all the best for Christmas and a happy new year. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
That's great.